Look at this. It's the original C programming language. It's the Kernighan and Ritchie from 1978. I found it in a box, and so how about that? I actually have I have an original COBOL too from like 1957. Even though I'm not that old, but I got that from IBM. Today on Secure Digital Life, all these old books notwithstanding, we're going to talk about modern vulnerability scanners. Andy Pete's going to join us again via Skype. We don't have any attack dogs today, so unfortunately we don't have any exciting events like that. Russ is joining us via Skype, and we're going to look at a demo of actually scanning the network. So we have diagrams too. So stick around.
This is a Security Weekly production.
Welcome to Secure Digital Life. If your users are going to keep putting risky stuff on your machine, you're screwed. So, Top can help us understand the complexity of blockchain.
I was reading through the show notes, man, and oof.
In binary, it would be 001. Who cares? But it's probably not significant anyway. Be like you're looking out through the HAL dot, you know, like, oh, hey, Dave.
It's like Sims, but with, you know,
it would be like
I,
Sims.
Instead of AI, it's only.
Roger Williams University is a premier destination for cybersecurity, offering in-person and online classes designed and taught in collaboration with industry experts. Using virtual environments that simulate real-world systems, you'll solve complex cyber issues and analyze cyber threats to prepare you for in-demand jobs in this rapidly growing field. Whether you're just starting out or want to advance in the cyber profession, RWU offers degrees and coursework at all levels. Learn more at rwu.edu/cyber. Yeah, Hack NYC, May 9th and 10th is coming right up. That's a two-day workshop if you're interested in that, $14.99. The code TZ10 will get you a discount on that show, so check it out. There's a link to that on the show. Source Boston and other cons are coming up, so if you're planning to go to Black Hat, DEF CON, all those kind of things, you better be getting tickets because I know they're going to sell out. And you're going to have a big, big problem if you don't book early. We were already booking, and I think we're going to have to stay at like the Tam O'Shanter or something, or maybe in like a dumpster. But, you know, it's all good. And Vegas dumpsters are supposed to be really pretty nice, actually, and lots of free food and other like materials. Be sure and check out our on-demand material. You may not know that. Some of our previously recorded webcasts are now available on demand at securityweekly.com on demand. Check out Source Boston 2018, May 9th and 10th. So if you're not in New York, you can be in Boston, all those. Go to sourceconference.com and register using the code, it's going to be a good one, I'll do it the good way. Sierra Whiskey 75, Whiskey Mike Kilo Whiskey. So SW75WMKW to get a $75 discount on Source Boston, and you really should be going to that one if you're on this end of I-95. So be sure and check that out. Ticket sales are open. Okay, so here's one more. Ticket sales are open for Social Engineering Rhode Island Conference. So if you want to do that kind of stuff, which is pretty interesting, that's going to be Saturday, June the 6th at Salve Regina University in beautiful Newport. If you don't know, that university's in a bunch of old mansions, so it's like going to like a really strange, you know. I'm sorry, did I not say June? June 6th is what it is. It's 16th? Voices in my head are telling me. The 16th. Okay, so hey, Burgundy reads what's on the slide, baby. So just move on from that. The link, which is se-ri.org, if you want to register for that one. Patrick Leverty will be joining us for an interview next week. Stay tuned to hear more about that conference as well. So lots of stuff going on, especially if you're in the general region here. If you're not, there's lots of stuff going on everywhere else. In fact, another one I'll mention is Wild West Hackin' Fest is starting to shape up for October. We went last year. It was really cool. So if you're going to get tickets and all that kind of stuff, it's probably not really too soon to be planning ahead. But finally, I tell you, finally, we're going to talk about the third day. On the third day, there was vulnerability scanning. And after light and C and all that stuff, there was vulnerability scanning because as soon as, all the stuff gets put together. I did want to apologize for pranking everybody with that Damon thing last week because because it is pronounced demon, and I was sort of doing an inside joke with myself, which I do, and then nobody gets it. But just as a sidebar, daemon, D-A-E-M-O-N, which is used to, we've talked about those a lot, is a derivative of an ancient Greek word, and it was correctly, I contacted the head of languages and asked him, how do you say this in ancient Greek? And he said it was pronounced daimon in ancient Greece. So we all say demon, and we were having some fun with the dogs and everything last week. So just so everybody's clear on that, and I still say Ben D, so sorry, Paul, that's life in the big city. But we are going to talk about vulnerability scanning, and we're going to talk about different tools today with Andy and Russ. Hi, Andy and Russ.
Hey, Doug. How you doing? Hi, everyone.
They all said hi, I think.
Oh.
Okay, it's fine. So when you start getting into vulnerability scanners and you start getting into tools, the tools in vulnerability scanning range all the way from like open source type stuff that you can go get from GitHub or wherever, to very sophisticated, very complex, very expensive tools that you can buy licenses for. And if you're an enterprise, you're probably on that end. And if you're an individual, you may be on this end. Or maybe you have a good fortune to be at a school or somewhere where they have access to some of these things. Like we have access to NetSparker. And there's lots of other tools out there that people have licensing for. So you should get something and start playing around with it. Andy actually took the time to make diagrams. So, you know, he actually built, and these are on the show notes, so you can check. I know you can't see them here, but they're on the show notes if you want to check them out. And they're in better colors. I ran out of like CN or something on my printer, so they're all blue. But these are actually how he is advocating setting up vulnerability scanning networks, and I can find no fault with it. It's the way I would set mine up, and when I've set these kind of things up. Most of these kind of scanners really go on and they start looking for servers. So some of it's on that front end type of scanning like we've talked about with Nmap sort of thing. So you're looking just what's out there. So it's building a network map so you can actually see what something looks like. And then expanding into web daemons, looking for vulnerabilities and things like that. And they start to expand into scripts and code that are going to run actual exploits against these servers. So they may just be very simplistic and they're looking for, say, a signature of something. That's one kind of thing that we're looking for. They may also then expand and start looking for the ability to run an actual exploit. So for instance, a really common exploit that a lot of people learn sort of on day one when they start trying to play around with this stuff is cross-site scripting. And cross-site scripting can expand from being a very simple thing. So just what they call reflective cross-site scripting attacks, where you're basically just linking into somewhere other place, to very, very sophisticated cross-site scripting attacks. But basically, somebody's embedding a reference to another website on your site and making you look bad. And sometimes you hear people call these defacements and things like that. A JavaScript could easily push tags onto a page. And if that happens, then a vulnerability scanner would look for the ability to do that very same thing and report that back. A second example I would put together would be something like a remote code execution in bin-d or bind. You can say it however you like. It's fine. I've been saying bin-d for a long. Most of you weren't born when I started saying bin-d, but I'm going to keep saying it. But if you were looking at remote code execution, a vulnerability scanner might actually be loaded with known vulnerabilities in bin-d versions. So, for instance, a really old version of bin-d that I know has a remote code exploit in it is version 9.4.2, if it's running on Red Hat. And the libbin-d library actually allows these exploits. So a vulnerability scanner might actually just be looking and querying these things to see if that version actually existed, or it might actually test the library by running a script to attempt to do the remote code exploit, and therefore it's going to produce a report. What do you think, Russ? You have any examples of these?
The Linux, not so much, but as far as the cross-site scripting issue that we had, I noticed that it's either the New York Times or the New Yorker or one of those online web versions of their paper or their journal had loaded in one of the sidebars a cross-site script that enabled CryptoLocker to install itself on 10,000 people's machines.
Ouch. Well, that's always fun.
Yeah.
So one thing to comment as well about vulnerability scanners is that a good one, so they should actually produce fairly sophisticated reports. And you should try to get the list of vulnerabilities, and you have to interpret it not just by taking the report and saying, here's the report, I'm done. You have to actually review the report and start looking at the risk that's going to actually affect you from that report. Because you're going to get, the first time you run these things, you're going to get massive lists of all sorts of very obscure things and very common things. And I really hate it when I see an automated report where somebody just pushed a print button. And I did a response on one of these a couple of months ago, and a client called me and said, could you take a look at this? This is what we got for our money. And I looked at the report, and basically all they did was they used a very well-known vulnerability scanner, and they pushed a print button. No fault of the vulnerability scanner. It's just the fact that they didn't get any analytics on this. So all they got was this big, massive list of exploits. Some of these exploits are obscure. So you start seeing things, and most vulnerability scanners are going to give you a score for that, like how common it is or how dangerous it is, to try and give you some guidance. But you really need the person, if you're paying somebody to do this or you're doing it for someone, you need to expand on that guidance and start looking at, do you want to just accept this risk? I mean, I worry a lot about that, because when somebody tells me they're just going to accept a risk, I'm like, okay, well, knock yourself out. But all of this leads to the process that's called remediation. And remediation of risk means that you addressed it. It doesn't mean you fixed it even. It just means that you addressed it. And so there's several different categories of this that come up before we get to this demo. One of them is that you corrected it. So you actually fixed whatever the problem was. So this would, in the case of that bin-D exploit, you upgraded to a current version of bin-D, and now that particular exploit no longer exists. That library's been patched, and all these things are done. So correction could be prevention. It could mean you put a firewall in front of it so that nobody can get to it. You could take the server offline. You can do all kinds of things with that. You could do updates. You could do patches. I'm going fast because we all want to see this demo. No pressure, Andy. We could mitigate the risk. So if we want to mitigate risk, we can just reduce it. So this means that we may actually reduce the likelihood that this could actually occur. So if we put another tool in place that's going to watch for signatures of someone trying to exploit this remote code execution or whatever, we might actually be able to keep that old version running. And a lot of people ask me, say, Doug, why would I ever keep an old version? But the truth is that when you get into enterprise level stuff, you may actually be sitting on a situation where changing that is going to have a huge dramatic impact on other things in the organization, and you can't just pull it out and put a new one in. So mitigation may be something that you want to do. So you may reduce it by prevention or other means. You can accept it and just say, okay, come get me. But sometimes people do accept risks because they say, you know, look, the likelihood of this exploit is so low and the impact of it is so small. If somebody did exploit it, oh well, and I'm not going to cry about it, and it's not worth our investment of effort and time. Now, a lot of security people don't like that kind of attitude, but when you get into the practical means of how do I pay for all this, sometimes you are just going to have to say, okay, this group we're going to leave alone. And then, of course, you can transfer it. So transference of risk means that you underwrite it. So that means someone goes ahead and then you go get an insurance policy that says if this occurs, they will pay this much money to our customers, or whatever kind of underwriting you want to get. So sometimes risks just can't be eliminated. And you know, physical security is always a good way to talk about it, because if you say, what's the likelihood somebody's going to come through the front door with a weapon? And you can insure against that. You can put up bollards, which are like big concrete things or stuff. You could put a gate. You could put a trap.
Man trap. Yeah.
A man trap. Like, yeah, they used to have these at the bank where I worked, and you had to walk through there, and there were these like little vents at the top. And I was like, what comes out of those vents? And he was like, you're not allowed to ask that question. And I was like, okay. Made me real nervous about walking in there. But you need to establish a baseline for this in all cases. What is the level of risk that you can afford? What is the level of risk you're willing to accept? What are you going to transfer? And what's going to happen if these risks get exploited? Because if you haven't done these things, running vulnerability scans, which is always a good thing, but if you don't even understand the level of risk you can accept and how you're going to mitigate it or how you're going to remediate it, then basically what happens is you get this big, thick report back. You flip through it and you go, okay, I don't know, what should we do first? And maybe you say, we're going to resolve all these. Okay, fine. That's cool if you think you can. But you may not be able to in practice. But Andy is going to show us a demo of a lab model that he has built, and he's got these slides up so you can actually see them. And so I'm going to let Andy tell us about his demo. Andy?
Great. Thanks for having me on the show again.
You bet.
Thanks, Andy.
Oh, I'm sorry?
Thank you.
You're welcome. So I have a demo copy of Rapid7 Inside VM, which is their current enterprise vulnerability scanning solution. I want to go over a few components of it before I really dive into the diagram or the actual demo. So the solution is broken out into a few different pieces. There's the security console itself, which is your central management. It's where you go in and look at your vulnerabilities, configure all your scanning, and do all of your work. Then you have your scan engines. Those are the actual scanners that you deploy out inside of your network. And then the last piece is a cloud scanner that Rapid7 has hosted out, I think is an AWS. And that's used for external scanning, so you don't have to go out and find a place to run your own scanner for your external vulnerability scanning. And there's actually another component that you can use. They have an agent that you can install on the machine that reports back to the console every few hours as to which patches are installed on the machine, information about local users, shares, anything that could be used by the vulnerability scanner to determine vulnerabilities. So that's a very high-level overview of the solution. What I have up on the screen right now is a kind of an ideal setup if you're in a basic WAN LAN DMZ setup. You're going to want to drop a scanner into your DMZ, which you can see down here, along with your web servers, any other servers you may have. Oh, let's get that out of here. Any other servers that you may have that you want to scan. As I mentioned on the show last week, the reason you want to stick a scanner inside your DMZ and not scan from the outside or from your LAN is because your firewall, at a simple layer 4 could be blocking, certain ports to certain IPs, and then you could be going all the way up to layer 7 with IPS or some other form of inspection that's being done by the firewall, and you won't get a true picture of what's going on those machines inside the DMZ. And
Andy, there's also the issue of throughput and time. I mean, if you're doing this in real time, which you may well be, you can tie up a lot. You can reduce your throughput on your firewalls, which may cost you customers and things like that. And the other comment I had about this, if you're trying to build these things, I used to build them on little rack server boxes that you could buy for like $100, or you can reuse old equipment that you can build these scanning sensors on to put out in different parts of your network. So you can literally just, or even old laptops or all these kind of things, because if you're testing, these are not production systems. So you can use an old laptop. You may have 50 or 100 of them sitting in the back room where you recovered them. You can use those kind of things and take them out and begin create sensors.
Right. Yeah, and most of the enterprise products and a lot of the other ones that are out there today have a wide variety of options for what you can use to deploy a scan engine. With the lab, I'm actually using a virtual appliance for both the scanning console and the scan engine. They have installers that you can deploy a Linux VM or have a physical box. Windows, I believe Mac OS is supported. So as Doug said, you can really stick it on just about anything and put it in your network. And he's absolutely right with the throughput on the firewall as well. So kind of cut and paste. You're going to want an external scan engine to scan everything from outside the firewall. That's going to give you a really, really good picture of what your exposure is to the outside world. And then once again, on the internal network, your LAN, you're going to want to drop a scan engine in there as well. So what I've actually put in this diagram is a dumbed down version of the lab that I built without a lot of the IP information in it. The trial that I have of the vulnerability scanning tool only allows me to use the scanner that's built into the console. So I wasn't able to deploy these different scan engines into the lab that I built. But what I did was I just tweaked some firewall policies so that the scan engines could go through and hit everything and have full access to all the segments of the network. So I want to move on over to a little more detailed diagram. Once again, those will be up on the show notes. It's not critical, the additional information, but I did want to be a little, more detailed as to what was set up. So I've got the various servers with their IP addresses in here. That way, if anyone wants to reference this while going through the show live or pre-recorded, as we're going through the product itself, we can they can follow properly. So it's a pretty basic setup. I've got a WAN environment out here. It's a private IP, but in real world, this would be your public IP addresses. So anything that doesn't fit into the 10 or the 192 or the 172.16, I believe it's a /20. I won't get into that any further. So this is the setup that I did. I set everything up. I've done some initial scanning as well, just so I have some information in the product to show you guys. Because scans sometimes can take a little bit of time, and I didn't want to be stuck in a case where we ran out of time on the show and I didn't get to show you everything. So I want to pop on over to the product now. So this is the security console and the main dashboard you get when you log in. Depending on what product you're using, you may get different information. Inside VM gives you this nice dashboard that tells you how many assets you have, what your risk is. As this is a fairly new lab, so there's not a ton of long-term information in here. But let's say I had this lab running for 6 months, and I kept adding hosts and was patching, and new vulnerabilities are coming out. Instead of it being a nice flat line or this slope line, you get more of a up and down graph that lets you track your vulnerabilities and your assets over time. So a few concepts with Inside VM just to go over so everyone can follow pretty easy. You break your environments into sites, and then you have your assets or IP addresses for your systems, and then you set up your credentials, and then you actually have your scan templates themselves, which I just timed out here. As Doug was mentioning earlier, the way a lot of these tools work is they go out and they run scripts, or they're looking for a certain piece of information on an endpoint. Those are called plugins. Some of the ones I'm going to show you are looking at Windows machines and checking the registry to see if certain keys are there, and maybe looking to see if there's a Windows patch in place. And that's just a general overview of the solution. So what I've got set up in here is I set up 2 different sites, the internal network and the DMZ. And I'll do a quick run through of the configuration on the scanning so you guys can see what I did. So under assets, you can put your assets in by IP address, or you can give an entire subnet. The difference between doing that is if you know what your assets are, you can put the individual IPs in, and it's only going to scan those assets. If you put an entire subnet or multiple subnets in there, it's going to scan that entire subnet every time a scan kicks off. What's beneficial there is if you're adding new machines to a subnet, the scanner will automatically pick up on it.
Andy, there was a question. What's the difference?
Oh, sure.
What's the difference between a credential scan, an agent scan, and what was the other one, John?
I think you said network scan.
And a network scan.
Yep. So a credentialed scan, which was actually what I was about to get to. So I'll break that out. There's 2 different types of scans from an authentication standpoint. You can do an authenticated scan, which is also known as a credentialed scan, or you can do an unauthenticated scan. The difference is with unauthenticated, you're not using any credentials to authenticate to the endpoint that you're scanning. So this is the guest access that Doug was talking about last week. So that's one level of scanning that you can do. It's what somebody will see if they don't have credentials to that endpoint or set of endpoints. The other side of the coin is an authenticated or credentialed scan where you're using credentials for that system to log into it, and then you have much more access to the system, and you can gather a lot more information. When it comes to a Windows machine, it's going to log in, it's going to look through the registry, it's going to pull all the patches that are in there. Anything else that it may choose to pull. I believe Inside VM pulls which users are on the system, what shares are on the system. An agent scan is that little piece I was talking about earlier, as far as the components, where you can actually install an agent into the endpoint, and that agent reports on vulnerability and patch information and anything else that the vendor wrote the agent to do. So rather than running all the plugins against the endpoint itself, what's happening is it's using information that it pulled from the machine in more of a passive manner to learn about vulnerability information.
That's like what I was talking about BIND 9.4.2. I mean, an agent scan can actually go in there and find in the registry or whatever the equivalent is what software is installed in that machine, what's running. It can look at those things and pull their version information down, and then that gets you a much more detailed profile of what everything looks like. Yep.
And then a network-based scan is that instead of using an agent, it's connecting over the network and using a variety of tools. It may be Nmap scanning the endpoint before it does anything else, just to determine which ports are open. And then it starts digging into those to see what's running. Is it Apache IIS if it's a web server? And then it runs the plugins against that host to determine what vulnerabilities actually exist within the endpoint.
And network subnet scans also detect rogue things. So if somebody's put a server up on their desk, which people do stuff like that, and it's sitting out there running, you'll pick those up instead of these targeted things where you say, this is an asset, I'm going to scan it, and now I'm just gathering information. So.
Yep. So talking about the credentialed versus unauthenticated scans. As you can see in here, I've gone through, I've configured a number of credentials. So an SSH account for the virtual firewall that I'm running, an SSH account for the Linux servers that are running in the environment, and then a domain admin account so that I can log into all the machines. One of the other pieces that I talked about was templates. The nice thing is a lot of the enterprise products come with a number of templates out of the box, which have their own set of plugins. You can even go in here, create your own scan template, and you can choose all sorts of different parameters. You can have it do ICMP, and you can just do ARP requests. A lot of metrics with how you do the scanning. You can have it be stealthier if you want it to try and get around some sort of intrusion prevention or intrusion detection system. You can have it perform safe or unsafe checks. So if you don't want to potentially crash a bot, unsafe checks, but if it's something, let's say you've got a development environment and you want to hit it with everything you've got, you can come in here and configure it to run unsafe checks. And those are really checks that Rapid7 or whoever the vulnerability scanner manufacturer is deems could cause harm to your environment if you use it. Could crash a service, could take an entire, if you scan in your storage with an unsafe check, it could take your entire storage down. And then you have your different plugins. And there are quite a number. This one has...
You're cutting out, Andy.
And what this number of, as you can see here, it's got about 370.
Ooh.
That it
having a little technical difficulty there, I think. I think Andy is gone.
Gotta love technology. Maybe he firewalled himself into a corner.
His employer detected him running his vulnerability scanner and like, yeah, you're shut down. Or it's like the FBI is like beating on the door, and it's just like, yeah, okay, come out, get down on the floor, put the laptop aside. Of course, he's got. Is he gone now?
You guys see me at all?
Oh, now I can.
Oh, all right. It seemed to be that opening out of the tab didn't make everything happy.
Yeah, you just started cutting out. So.
I was just going over some details on the on if you wanted to customize your own scan template and choosing how it scans, which template. Inside VM has about 370,000 checks that it can perform when doing vulnerability scanning. So this is the the really nitty gritty of the configuration. Some of the other configurations I can choose which scan engine I want to use. As I said, I don't have access to use multiple scan engines with this demo, so I'm just using the one built into the console. You can have it send email alerts while it's scanning, which you got to be careful, because if you're having it email you on vulnerabilities and you're scanning a machine that has hundreds of vulnerabilities, you're going to get hundreds of emails. And it can get quite cumbersome to deal with that when they just keep flying into your inbox. And then lastly, what you can do is you can configure these to run on a schedule, which is, if you're working in an environment where you're trying to actively monitor your vulnerabilities throughout a day-to-day process, you're going to want to have your scanning running on a schedule so that you don't have to go in and manually kick off scans, because as you get into a rather large environment and have a lot of different scans configured, that can be very difficult to manually manage.
And we always like to particularly have automated scanning looking for rogues and things like that, because one of the big threats that I kept seeing when I was auditing was people setting up rogue systems, rogue WAPs, and all these kind of things. And so if you have these scheduled scans, you're not just going to get that one little snap, because you'll see companies do this. They have one little snapshot they did once a year, and then that's it. They don't look at it again until the next year, and that to me is a big risk.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. You definitely want to be scanning very frequently. I just had a thought and I lost it. But let me dive into some of the assets and show you guys some of the vulnerabilities that it came up with.
Okay.
So what I've got here is the asset list. I'm gonna dial in because there was one in particular I wanted to show you to give you. Actually, let me talk about this dashboard right here. So this dashboard lists all your assets, and what's really, really nice that Inside VM does is it gives you several pieces of information about your assets. So I want to focus in on a few of these columns right here. So this little biohazard symbol, if I remember right, actually I don't remember what this does. I just blanked on it. Sorry, let me move on to this one. The shield with an arrow. What this means is there are published exploits for the vulnerabilities that are found on this machine. Yeah. So this Windows 7 machine, which I intentionally stuck in there because Windows 7 is going to be end of support in less than 2 years, so it's it's growing more and more riskier as time goes on. As you can see, it's got almost 700 vulnerabilities in it, and that's because I deployed this and intentionally didn't patch the environment. I built a vulnerable environment, so we had some content. And what this is telling me is there are 414 exploits available for the vulnerabilities on this machine. That's a really handy piece of information to have when you're working with vulnerability scanning, and you're choosing what and you're moving into the stage of remediation. So your first step is you do all your scanning, and then you start remediating your vulnerabilities. And when you have a large environment, that's a rather large task to undertake. So choosing where to start can sometimes be a difficult decision. And what Inside VM has done is allowed you to get a little more information as to how risky you are from these vulnerabilities. And one of them is, are there exploits available? So if there's not an exploit available for a vulnerability, it's still vulnerable, but it's not as risky as a vulnerability that has a known and published exploit. And then it'll give you the number of vulnerabilities. It uses the severity of the individual vulnerabilities to calculate a risk score. What's really, really nice about most of the enterprise products is you can adjust the scoring system based on your own preference so that it adjusts the risk of the vulnerabilities to better fit your organization and your needs. And that's really important. And going back to what Doug said is, choosing what you want to remediate, and how risky it is to your environment. If it's something that is not used very often, and if it gets compromised, has very little impact to your environment, that's a much lower risk. So you may want to adjust the risk in your vulnerability scanning so that it treats that as a lower risk, and then you can focus on what's more important.
And I mean, one of the things I always notice is like, if there's a system sitting in a lab somewhere that, Dr. Chang is managing that lab, and in Chang's lab, nobody can even get in that lab without they use a VPN to connect, and they have all these credentials. I've reduced, how much exposure that has. And a lot of times it's not just as simple in practice as saying, just fix all that. Because you may go out to enterprise users and say, fix all that, upgrade to Windows 10, and they say, I can't do that. I mean, I've seen people where they were running Windows XP, and you're saying, well, you need to get rid of that, and they say, well, I can't because this piece of software I wrote only runs on Windows XP. I used to support this guy's box that he was running all these old Fortran programs on, and he basically had to stay in that environment that he had set up, and he just had no choice about it.
Right. Yeah, and I've seen that a lot in a lot of different environments where, you have an application or, a piece of hardware even that isn't compatible with newer operating systems, so it's not necessarily feasible to upgrade.
Or you go in and say, replace this piece of hardware, and they say, well, that's going to cost $48,517, and we have a budget of $6.
Yeah, it was funny you said 48,000. I was just about to say that I had an instance where we had something. It was a really old device that doesn't use any encryption for its management protocols, and it's $40,000 to replace it.
Yeah.
So you can't always just rip it out of your environment. In that case, you have to try and cut your exposure, by doing something like isolating it into its own VLAN and then having access to that device be from a machine in that VLAN that is patched and secure, and then you access it that way.
Well, and that's where you can get into like other types of controls too. You can say, well, I'm going to put a big firewall in front of this, and I'm not going to let people get to it. And you have to. But again, the vulnerability scanner lets you see that. You can then evaluate those risks and decide which of these things are we going to, how are we going to remediate each of these risks, and you have to address all of them. So it may just be we're going to accept the risk, or we're going to prevent, we're going to reduce the risk so that it doesn't have as much exposure.
Exactly. I know I was going to say earlier when you were talking about rogue discovery, Inside VM and a lot of the other products integrate with a number of things as well. But Inside VM can hook into your Active Directory environment.
Right.
It can hook into vCenter, so that if you add a VM in VMware to your vCenter environment, Inside VM's automatically going to pick up on it. Mm-hmm. And they've actually added some features where you can do automated actions that if it detects a new VM added to your vCenter environment, it automatically kicks off a scan on that VM.
And that's been a massively growing threat in the last 5 years in terms of people being able to put, whether it's open box or it's VMware or it's AWS or whatever, and being able to spin up boxes that on the fly and create new risks and rogues and all these kind of things in the network. Yep,
exactly. So back to some of the vulnerabilities. I'm going to drill into this Windows 10 machine.
Well, I tell you what, Andy, you think that I could get you to come back next time and we drill into the vulnerabilities some more then, because we're kind of running long?
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, why don't we just plan then that next week on the show we'll pick this back up and we can continue digging through the vulnerabilities, because it's really interesting and I don't want to have to cut it off suddenly. So why don't we just plan on doing that? Is that okay with you?
Yeah, that's fine.
Okay, because it's lots of fun, and I love looking at these products. So since Andy's built all this lab stuff, we can spend some more time looking at it, because I know all of you are going to benefit from us talking about this. So why don't you tune in next week, and we will pick this right back up, and we will continue looking at all these vulnerabilities in Insight VM. Thank you, Andy. Thank you, Russ, and we'll see you next week on Secure Digital Life.